Why are we skiing towards the edge of the cliff? Why are we even getting close so that someone like me has to say, like, stop everything in the Pentagon and fix this problem? Why are we allowing this to happen? It's irrational. I think it's immoral, because if you can see the collision coming, then you have a moral responsibility if you don't do everything you can to avoid it.
Are China and the United States on a collision course? And if so, are we ready? This is the question we get into this week on part 2 of my discussion with Elbridge Colby. Elbridge is the founder of the Marathon Initiative. He's a former Pentagon official and advocate for a stronger U.S. strategy of defense and deterrence. He makes a passionate case for why the U.S. needs to take significant actions today to be prepared for the challenges that we already face, with more on the horizon. I'm Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics. Thanks for joining me here at Global Macro Update. All right, we're back with Elbridge Colby. Elbridge, thank you for doing this. Part 2 last week was all about Taiwan. So if you're a viewer and you missed it, you should go check that out. Today, we're going to talk about zooming back a little bit, talking about U.S. policy, the globe, and getting into a book that you wrote a little over 2 years ago called The Strategy of Denial, which was a fantastic book about your approach to how to deal with the increasing tensions between the U.S. and China. I want to start out by saying something that Henry Kissinger said towards the end of last year, where he acknowledged that we are, in fact, in a Cold War, a true Cold War, but one that's far more dangerous than the first. Do you agree? Are we now in a Cold War situation with China?
I don't love the Cold War analogy because I think it's partially true and partially not true. I think it's true in the sense that we are in a geopolitical, to your point last week about, heading to a collision. There's fundamental geopolitical interests that are in conflict. And there's a very real possibility of military conflict. Both sides are preparing for it. And a lot of it is about the two sides and their coalitions. I don't like the analogy in certain ways. One of the ways is I don't think we can assume that this Cold War will stay cold. I mean, I think it's a rivalry that could go hot. And there's two reasons that I think that that's true and how it's different from the Cold War. One is that during the Cold War, nuclear weapons were all over the place. And they were intimately integrated into both sides' military postures. So any war, basically, there was a lot of strategizing about it, but basically, both sides assumed that a big war between the two superpowers would go nuclear in a big way. That's actually not really true right now. And I go into this in my book. There is assessments that there, assumptions that a war could escalate to the nuclear level, but not in this sort of blowing up whole countries sense. It's a remote possibility, but both sides are practicing for conventional wars that might have limited nuclear elements. That's good in the sense that it's okay, it wouldn't be the immediately Armageddon if war broke out. But it's bad in the sense that it makes more war palatable because you could survive it, and both sides. The other thing is the perception of the stakes. To your question, Ed, last week, about Taiwan, is people are like, really? Even though China is actually a much stronger country in terms of economic strength than the USSR ever was, I think the perception of the USSR was much more fearful. Better dead than red. And people were backing up, potentially risking nuclear war over Cuba, you mentioned, or West Berlin. I think today people are like, hey, and most people, kind of normal people are like, I don't want China to dominate Asia, but is it really worth risking World War III? That's sort of the vibe. People aren't doing ducking under their desks, and people aren't building fallout shelters. And so that also means that people are going to be less willing to go to this, total nuclear war. But again, it means that China could say, well, the Americans don't care enough. I could win a war. And that's dangerous. So I think the Cold War analogy is probably overused. It has some relevance, particularly in the military context.
Okay. So since your book came out, a lot has changed, right? 2.5 years or so. If I understand, and it's been a while since I read the book, so forgive me if I don't get it quite right, but my recollection is that you recommended that the U.S. from a policy perspective and a spending perspective, that we focus almost exclusively on China and denying China hegemon status in Asia. And that meant that our allies were going to need to step up. Europe needs to defend itself in large part. Same for the Middle East. Fast forward to today, right? Now we've got a hot war in Ukraine that China seems to be at some level participating in, or at least having given a green light. And we've got what is feeling like it's going to be an escalating war in the Middle East. And we're seeing Chinese weapons being used out of Hamas. So what if you had to update your book and your thinking today, what would that look like?
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, honestly, it would probably be more cowbell in the sense that, I mean, I actually think the book is, if anything, more relevant now than when it came out. I would say world events have confirmed my assessment. They certainly haven't changed any assessments. I mean, people talk about, oh, did the war in Ukraine change your assessment? No. I mean, I talk about in the book the potential for Russian invasion to NATO, and still say that we should focus on Asia. What's the most important thing, I think the point of my book that I would really stress at this point that I think is still not internalized, I think a lot of the book's arguments have progressively been factored into policy or in one way or another, but is the need to really focus and prioritize. And frankly, when I was hearing you talking, our government is not really thinking in the way that I am, but I actually think the Chinese might be. Like, whether or not they were behind the initiation of the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, that's hard to say. What they're clearly doing is helping to perpetuate them. Why? Because it distracts and depletes American resources, resolve, patience, political support, weapons, etc. So now we're in a situation of scarcity, right? Where we've spent a lot of money and the American people are now saying, I don't want to spend so much money. So we have limits on, nobody's talking about dramatic increase in the defense budget. Right. And interest rates are too high for dramatic borrowing, unless we're in like real extremists. Our weapons stockpiles have been significantly depleted. And if you just read, like Greg Ip had a good column in December in the Journal, just pointing out how, moribund our defense industrial base. And whose fault is that? Okay, we can argue about that till the cows come home. What matters is we ain't going to fix it even with, high level movement for a long time. And by the way, that high level movement isn't coming along. I've been calling for over a year for national mobilization of our defense industrial base. Is that happening? Not really. There's a little bit, on specific weapon systems, but not really. So we are in a situation of scarcity. And the main threat that I was calling attention to geopolitically for us in the world, we have neglected. Obviously, we're neglecting it. People say, oh, we're deterring China in Ukraine. I mean, it's not a serious argument at the end of the day. Clearly, like, China's going to be deterred in Taiwan or not at all, in that area. It's military force. Military force is not like flying around in cyberspace. It's iron and people and ships and, that kind of thing. We're in very bad shape. So the main, and this is my rhetoric and my engagement has become more, and for off and on, I put this as my pinned tweet, is like, why am I so sharp? Because the situation has deteriorated. I mean, I said, when I was in the Pentagon, I said the system is blinking red already. That was like six years ago, almost. And now we really haven't, we've done some changes, but nothing compared to the trajectory of the Chinese buildup. But this is, again, where the business analogy is like, if you're at like Ford or Chrysler in 1978, you're saying, come on, boss, I'm doing so much better than I used to. And your boss says, well, we're still getting our lunch eaten by Honda and Toyota. That's what matters. Whether you've increased, like we're patting ourselves on the back for doubling artillery ammunition production while the Russians have like centupled it or something, right? That's the standard. It's all relative. And we have to grapple with scarcity. And this to me is like a basic bit like Steve Jobs, Harvard Business School kind of thing, is like focus on making sure you get your priority right. And we're not doing that.
How bad is it, in your opinion? Could we defend ourselves from a major conflict here, and can we defend our allies, should we so choose?
Here at home, I mean, there are real gaps in our defenses that we've known about. I am concerned about homeland strikes by China in the event of a conflict, because we would probably very likely be hitting their mainland as well. I think those strikes would be more likely to be selective, focused on our defense industrial base and our flow of forces from some of our key military facilities or command and control. But, we have not been hit at home since, in a material way, since, I don't know, the War of 1812, or I guess the Civil War, depending on how you define it.
September 11th.
Well, that's true, right? September 11th, but by a kind of, exactly. But by another significant major power military.
Right.
Yes, absolutely, you're right about that. Of course, I shouldn't forget that. But I think where the real question is along the First Island chain. But the thing is, the First Island chain, as you say, is right next to China. The problem is there isn't much between the First Island chain and California, right?
Right.
That's the problem with the oft-heard talking point that the Chinese and sometimes the Singaporeans use. Oh, the Pacific is big enough for both of you. And it's like, oh, well, on our side is like Kwajalein and Samoa and Midway Island, and they have Japan and South Korea and all the Asian tigers. Okay, that doesn't make sense. That's the way the geography and the economic productivity works. There, we're in real trouble. I would say we're in the window of vulnerability where an opportunity where I think Xi Jinping could make a decision this year. I think it's more likely as the decade goes on, but it's not impossible this year. But I'd put the probability lower. But also, we're in a window where it's not clear. I mean, CSIS, which is a big think tank in Washington, did a whole bunch of wargaming, and the U.S., in their estimate, usually ended up, it was kind of a draw, like a Korea-style draw over Taiwan at very high cost. But they actually confessed that, this is their statement, the classified wargaming is much more pessimistic about American chances. Now, nobody knows. Wargaming is very speculative and contingent and so forth, based on the evidence, the rules, and all that. But I think we're in a situation where we're really on the cusp, and this is a terrible situation to be in. Now, the administration's main line, and others, that Bloomberg was reporting in January, is the PLA, the Chinese military, doesn't think it's ready, and it's like, well, so we're not saying that we have more missiles. It's not saying that we're well positioned. It's not saying that we have much better technology. It's not saying that our resolve is much higher. It's saying that the Dallas Cowboys or the New England Patriots are just, they've been slacking off in the offseason, or they haven't made as much progress as they, because that's what we're hearing, and I'm like, that it's kind of last refuge of scoundrel sort of problem, which is like, well, as Don Rumsfeld said before we invaded Iraq, ill-advisedly, you go to war with the army you have. Maybe Xi Jinping says, yeah, they're not quite ready as they should be, but they're readier than the enemy. And we're never going to be relatively readier. And why people say, oh, Xi Jinping's purging his generals, it must mean they're not ready. Well, maybe, or maybe it means he's saying, I really expect you to be ready to fight. And I'm getting rid of the dead wood because I'm serious about this.
Right.
I don't know. I think there's definitely fire there as well as smoke. But I'm saying if we're relying on the PLA, who, by the way, fought the Americans back from the Yalu River when they were all in sandals in the middle of winter after a huge civil war and a Japanese invasion, let's not be like too arrogant here. I mean, we lost to the draw. We had a draw in Korea, depending on how you defend it. And we lost in Vietnam. So, like, haven't we learned this lesson? I mean, we lost in Afghanistan, at least from a political point of view. Where are we? Where do we get off being so hubristic?
So, if you were back in the Pentagon, or if you were back in the White House, what would your recommendations be?
Let's focus on this, and let's make sure that we have the military resources where they need to be, not only in 10 years, but today, in a month, in a year, in 5 years, and in 10 years. And I would say, if I were king for a day, or I were advising the king in the Pentagon, I'd say, clear my calendar and clear the secretary's calendar. He's got the president's backing, hopefully. Are you going to help me address this issue? If not, or if you're giving me petty fog, or you're just something else, you're off the calendar. And by the way, if I think you're dragging your feet at all, you're fired. You're not getting promoted. I'm promoted. This is like way past the time where we're going to cry about people getting promoted. This is like for the big stakes. Like, are you going to solve my problem now? And well, it's a little complicated. No. Now we have no time. That's it. Then where's the money? Do we need the money? Can we get more money from the Congress? We'll try to get more money, but also we need to reprogram money and reorient money within the program on this issue. We need forces postured. Oh, you got the Allies calling up. Oh, the Germans are calling up. No, the Germans can wait. They're not doing their part. I want to talk to the Japanese. I'm going to talk to the Taiwanese, and I'm going to read them the riot act that they need to step up big time. I'm going to talk to the Australians. I'm going to talk to the Poles because they pull their weight. I'm going to talk to the Indians. I'm going to talk to people who are serious about this, and I'm going to reward good behavior, basic leadership, right? Reward, incentive, and I'll tell you, having worked in the Pentagon, it's the largest, flattest pyramid you've ever seen. People in that organization who are in the uniform are incredibly sensitive to the incentives at the top. You can't give them bonuses. You know, what you can give them are promotions and various kinds of rewards, medals or whatever. Not whatever, they're very important. They signify something very important. But I mean, that's what you allocate accordingly. You say, this is the kind of thing. Dick Cheney, I disagree with him a lot, but when he was Secretary of Defense, he did something very important in the run up to the Iraq War in 1990. He fired the Chief of Staff of the Air Force who had gotten off message. But I think he was basically making a signal like, Cheney's the guy in charge, and you're going to follow this, and this is what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's, and then we make our best effort, and hopefully that's enough. I mean, you mentioned Neil. Neil was like, well, if Republicans get in and they follow or go along with some of the arguments Bridge has been making, that will create some problems of its own. That it may precipitate action sooner, so that the Chinese want to get out ahead of it. That's something we got to grapple with. But that's one of the reasons why it's kind of like day zero, H hour
Sure.
or whatever. You're ready from
Sure.
get. That's the kind of attitude.
Bridge, when I hear and see the passion of you talking about the solution, I mean, I very much feel it. When you wrote your book, you talked about how, again, I'm going by memory, but I think you said something to the effect of, we have to give it our best effort to protect and defend Taiwan. But it's not existential.
Right. Correct.
It's feeling existential now. Has your thought changed on that?
No, and thank you. I mean, on the passion, I mean, look, I try to be analytical and clinical and evidentiary in my analysis, but I am motivated by. I mean, look, I want to do well in my career and all these things that goes without saying. I wouldn't deny that, of course, but it's my conviction that the best thing for the American people, and frankly, the best thing for freedom and democracy in the world, is for us to not get in a war but meet our core interests. And I honestly just am flabbergasted that we continue to go it's like we're a major company running a self-defeating strategy, playbook, and just continue to go on like it. And I understand at an individual level why people do it, but I mean, again, I'm not a saint or anything. I just that's what motivates me. And I really don't want a war, because I think a war with China would be, at minimum, very destructive and kill a lot of people, but it could be much worse. And you go back and you look historically at what happens with wars. Not only were millions and millions of young men killed in the First World War in the most brutal ways imaginable, but then it creates Nazism and communism, or fosters and enables them. And then you have multiple follow-on problems that last for generations. So why are we skating on the edge? Why are we skiing on the edge of the cliff, towards the edge of the cliff? Why are we even getting close so that someone like me has to say, we're going to stop everything in the Pentagon and fix this problem? Why are we allowing this to happen? It's irrational. And I think it's immoral, because if you can see the collision coming, then you have a moral responsibility if you don't do everything you can to avoid it. So that's that's where, and I'm trying to break through, and I actually think I am breaking through. But the question is it doesn't matter if I convince them when they've already hit us.
Right.
That's the problem. To your question about Taiwan, no, I haven't changed my view at all. It's not existential. And I try to communicate that very clearly to them that we may have to give, we will have to give them up if they are indispensable, if they're indefensible, and the costs of defending them are too high. And that's like, duh, right? Like, sure. If we get into a situation where the Pentagon leadership comes to the president and says, we think they're going to invade in 2 days, the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan, and we can try, but we're going to take 80% losses and we're going to fail. Like, obviously, you're not going to do that, right?
Right.
Of course. And right. The most important factor in whether or not that's the assessment is actually not America's own changes, but actually Taiwan's own ability to fight. And they're behind the curve. So I'm trying to communicate that. You mentioned TSMC. One of the reasons I stressed to them that we have to disable TSMC in the wake if the Chinese take over the island is the only thing worse. Ken Griffin saying there would be a global depression if we lost TSMC. Okay, the only thing worse than that is if a hegemonic China controls TSMC.
So, last question for you, Elbridge, because I've taken a lot of your time and I appreciate it. But you talked about how to be ready for conflict. It takes iron, it takes manpower, makes men and women in the military ready and well trained, and the equipment that they need to do their job. I would argue that avoiding conflict also takes high level diplomacy. Right, it's and skilled diplomacy.
Yep.
In addition to the deterrence.
Yep.
What's your assessment of our diplomatic efforts and our ranks, given that they seem so spread thin with everything that's going on in the world right now?
Well, I agree with you. I am not a maximalist against China. I think it's actually the way and my book ends with actually a message to China, which is that my view is that my strategy, China could flourish and be one of the world's 2, and maybe as India rises, 3 superpowers if my strategy is successful, because the goal is a balance of power. It's not, I hate communism, but it's not about regime change. It's not about dismembering China. It's not about humiliating China, which is different than a lot of people who are on the hawk end of the spectrum, who have much more expansive goals vis-a-vis China. I'm not talking about global liberal hegemony. We will have to deal with a Chinese sphere of influence, a lot of Chinese power, etc. The way I think about it is China can achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation if my strategy is successful. So I actually agree with Neil that détente is the goal, but we have to have détente from a position of strength, more in the George Shultz kind of model. Of course, that involved the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a sort of benefit, obviously, but I'm not saying that has to be part of it. But more like, look, you're going to just hit your head against the wall if you come against the Americans and the Japanese and Taiwan, South Korea. Instead, go for your B+ rather than your A+ option from the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. How are we doing? I don't think very well. And because our diplomacy now, and if you talk to people, you listen to, say, like the Indians or others, it tends to be more hectoring and kind of like moralism and like a lot of rhetorical. I don't want to exaggerate. There's good diplomacy, people like Bill Burns going around doing important diplomacy. But I think what our diplomacy should be much more about is about arranging coalitions, reflecting the real power balance and countries' own interests, and trying to form coalitions, especially vis-a-vis China, to hold the balance of power. And then in regions that we're going to do less in, like Europe and the Middle East, we're not going to abandon them, but we need to have, it's more economy of force, as they would say in the military. You say, how do we foster relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel? That's an obvious one, but also Jordan, United Arab Emirates, et cetera, maybe Egypt. And in Europe, how do we work with the Europeans to get them to take more responsibility? And at the same time, my view is I'm actually somewhat dovish vis-a-vis Beijing on some of the political rhetoric and even the economic sanctions, because I don't think it's very effective. And it might actually further alienate them. What we want them to think is military aggression is not going to pay, and I have a graceful alternative exit, where the Americans will respect whatever it is that we need to do. And that's what I think we want, which is more the diplomacy of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. You mentioned Jim Baker, rather than of Tony Blinken. And in fairness, the Bush administration, it's a more hard-headed kind of, again, business-like approach to diplomacy and our geopolitics, which is, again, I think that's the appropriate approach for our country.
Elbridge, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time and all the work that you do, because it's so important. And the thing that I really appreciate selfishly, I have a hard time sometimes getting our audience of market participants to understand just how important the geopolitics is right now and how those worlds are on a collision course. So thank you for illuminating some of those issues.
Thank you, Ed.
Look forward to speaking with you again.
Me too. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Enjoyed talking to you a lot.
If you missed last week's discussion with Elbridge, where we discussed Taiwan's importance to U.S. national security, you can see it here.